Welcome to the Regeneration International podcast.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexis Badenmare. I'm the political director of the Organic Consumers Association. So I have the great pleasure this morning of getting to talk to Lynne Pledger and Ridge Shinn. They are the authors of Grass-Fed Beef for a Post-Pandemic World. And am I your first interview? Because this book doesn't come out until November.
Yes.
Oh, wow, that's so exciting. Okay, so excellent. And from the start, let's have you guys tell us where we can get this book, because everybody will want to go back to the beginning of the recording and say, wait, how do I get this book? Who's your publisher, and where can you find the book now?
Chelsea Green Publishing in Vermont is our publisher. And the book can be pre-ordered today or anytime from any place that sells books. And if you go to the Chelsea Green website, you can order it from there.
Awesome. Yeah, we love Chelsea Green. Excellent. All right. So you all have very interesting bios. I don't always read bios because it seems like, we can bring this out in conversation, but I want to read your bios because I think there are some things that won't come up as we talk. So Ridge, you're the founding CEO of Grazer LLC, and most people know that as Big Picture Beef, a 100% grass-fed beef company partnering with farmers throughout the northeastern United States. Early in your career, you became interested in heritage breeds of livestock, and you co-founded the group now known as the Livestock Conservancy. You were also the founding director of the New England Livestock Alliance, and that helps farmers find markets for their meat. In addition to managing your own Devon herd in central Massachusetts, you've consulted all over North America, New Zealand, England, Uruguay, Argentina, and for the Lakota of the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation. And your work has been recognized in Smithsonian, The Atlantic, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and they've dubbed you the Carbon Cowboy. And Lynne Pledger, you're a writer, an environmental advocate. You've worked on public policy issues, including waste reduction, climate change, and energy. You've worked with Clean Water Action, Sierra Club, Upstream, and you've been a guest lecturer on sustainability topics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Smith College, Lesley University, and Harvard School of Public Health. You've worked for decades with Ridge to preserve heritage livestock breeds and increase regenerative grazing in the Northeast United States. And you homeschooled your 2 kids and a grandchild. I'm so impressed. And you now live in Western Massachusetts, and you're an awesome writer, and you're writing a book of poetry. So I do want to also mention, as a big thank you to you both, how I met you. There were the USDA was doing I think it's every 5 years, they review what Americans should be eating and make recommendations, and then their recommendations are open for public comment. So in recent years, the word coming from USDA is that everybody needs to eat less meat. It's not good for you. It's going to give you cancer. And that's period. They don't talk about different ways that meat is raised. They don't talk about the health benefits of grass-fed beef versus like nitrate-filled lunch meats that are super processed. So that's how we met. You two wrote and circulated a fantastic letter that was signed on by tons of farmers, livestock producers all over the country, and submitted those comments to the USDA. So let's start there, because I think this is one of the hot topics. And it's a hot topic for me, certainly, because I was a vegetarian. I think I was still a vegetarian. I think it was like around 2015 that you guys wrote this letter, and I promoted it and loved it so much. But I was still a vegetarian because I'd been brainwashed early on, thinking that we can't feed the world, and without, we can't feed the world with the way we're currently farming livestock. It's just way too destructive. And some pieces of that are true. But recently, I've learned from you and other folks about how nutritious well-raised meat can be. And I ended up changing my diet around 2020. So I'm just one person who tells that story, but I think that's kind of something that's coming into fashion now, as being a former vegetarian and a new regenerative organic livestock eater. So why should people make this switch if they're thinking about the environment?
Well, we love the fact that you've switched. I love my biggest joys when I'm doing a tasting is to convert vegetarians, because so many of them come from a good place. I mean, I embraced many years ago diet for a small planet, and we should be eating the grain, not feeding it to the animals. Well, of course, that's perfectly true. But the cows can actually just eat grass and make their living. They don't need to eat grain. And it's a huge difference, but it's so hard for people to get their heads around it because of this prejudice that the cow's the problem. And the exciting thing is the cow's the solution. And but for most people, they just look at you and shake their head and say, "What are you talking about?" But we firmly believe it, and we think the book lays out that proposition.
Well,
So,
I like to offer a slightly different take on that, in that I think of the book as not so much about the individual dietary choices. It's not really about whether people should be vegetarians or not. We feel that vegetarians can embrace regenerative grazing of cattle, because it's really a critically important strategy for the environment, and particularly for the climate, our most urgent environmental crisis. So we do offer a very full chapter on the nutrition issues with both meat versus vegetarianism, but especially grass-fed versus grain-fed. But having said that, the thrust of the book, although it covers a lot of things, it covers animal welfare, it covers agricultural injustice and inequality. But I think the main thrust is the environmental thrust.
Yeah, there's a huge environmental case to be made. But while we're still talking about what people do eat or should eat, you also have a chapter in your book on fake meat. So why, if we're thinking fake meat versus real meat, what's the case for real meat?
Well,
go ahead, Lynn.
I think that if you look at the arguments for the fake meat, they are essentially our arguments for grass-fed as opposed to grain-fed, but they choose in the promotion of the fake meat to ignore that all their concerns about the environment are addressed by grass-fed meat, and that not only that, I think it's really important to say it's not just all the pollution we're preventing by raising beef on pasture alone, and not just the in those negatives, but there's all these positives. While we're combating climate change, we're also restoring farmland. We're also protecting against droughts and floods, and providing really excellent protein for needy world populations. And the world populations are getting more and more needy as weeks go by. And climate change is going to be really traumatic in terms of food that can no longer be grown where it's been grown for centuries. So it makes it doubly or triply more important not to be feeding our grains to livestock. And also, I just want to get in here one little known fact about the regenerative grazing, in that it makes the soil far more productive. We say anywhere, well, it's been documented 300% more productive in terms of biomass that can be generated from a piece of land. So we can grow by integrating livestock into cropping systems. We can grow a lot more food for a hungry world.
Yeah, one of our challenges as humans is that we think we can fix everything, and this propensity to do it in a lab or a factory or cellular meat, it just is insane that we think we can improve on nature. And, it's those are the things that are getting the funding. Those are the things that are exciting. All the big four meat companies have plant-based meat operations, but they're beginning to close them, interestingly. Tyson just built a big plant for plant-based meat, and they just closed it because it was an exciting thing for a while. But, at the end of the day, what's remarkable is that we have this technology that is time-tested. It's simple. It's called photosynthesis, and it works. You just have to get with it instead of fight it. And it is, as Lynn says, that the results are just stunning once you begin to understand that. And it's not a no-brainer. And most people don't think it's as sexy as, something grown in a lab, but it's remarkably sexy when you get it going. But what's interesting is we need a lot of people to get trained and to understand how to do it. It's not rocket science, but it's not a no-brainer. So, I feel it's a very exciting time because if the consumer can embrace this and understand, get some understanding of it, and go and demand the product from their vendor, all of a sudden, it's going to create this demand, which is, do all these things. It'll stop the flooding. It'll store carbon. It'll create, a rural economy that's vibrant again, and on and on. So those are the possibilities. But it's telling the story is, that's one of the reasons we're so tickled to have this book coming out, is because it does kind of present the argument in a very cogent way so that people with a half an interest can say, oh my God, look at this.
I can't resist pointing out that grass-fed beef is plant-based. Yeah. And that's one of the things that excites me that we cover in the book, is that it has been determined, in fact, that the phytonutrients from the pasture plants, the grasses and all the different forage plants, all those beneficial nutrients are concentrated in meat and milk from grass-fed animals. 2 or 3 times more riboflavin, for example. Right. And so it's particularly interesting because there's about 200,000 plant species on Earth, and the total crop, considering the world's crops, 80% of them are the same dozen plants. And so here we have this a world full of hundreds of thousands of sources of nutrition and beneficial nutrients that we could be tapping into, but we're kind of stuck in this. Of course, we're as humans, we're limited to we can't digest cellulose, but we know who can. Ruminant animals, cattle, can make use of all these wonderful plants. And one of our sidebars in the book, we point out how cattle are very discriminating about what they eat. They're not just plodding along and eating whatever's in front of them. They have that instinctual ability, what they need. And cattle in a pasture with a diversity of plants can provide for themselves both on a daily basis and in a situation where they're need to be self-doctoring themselves with food. So we have healthier meat, and we can benefit from this plant-based food by eating grass-fed beef.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think that's true, because what they're calling plant-based is often cell cultures, genetically modified microbes belching out proteins. It's not. I think you're right that grass-fed beef is actually more plant-based than a lot of the lab creations that they're marketing as plant-based.
Yeah, maybe we need a T-shirt.
Yeah, I actually heard a comedian talking about this recently, just locally. Like, his joke was that it actually cows create plant-based meat much better. Yeah, maybe we'll get some currency. So, this is such a wonderful opportunity, and anybody who's watching live on Rockfin, please take advantage, because people pay a lot of money, I'm sure, to get your consultation going into a grass-fed operation. And that's one of the things that I found most exciting about your book, is it really is a primer, a great 101 for anybody who is considering grass-fed livestock farming. And the way you pitch it is very compelling. You're making the case that you don't need a huge economic investment. Yeah, why don't you start there? Like, why would you, if somebody said, I want to go into farming, but I'm not a legacy farmer, I don't have land, I don't have a whole lot of money, why would you suggest grass-fed beef as an entry point to farming?
Go ahead, Rich. This is your.
Well, the thing is, it's so simple. There's cattle eat grass automatically. They just do it. There's so many ways to come at it. And there's, if you don't have, 1,000-acre farm and this and that. So there's so many ways that you can. It's kind of like my experience when I leased land from the local land trust, leased land from neighbors who have a lot of land but don't want it to grow up into brush and trees. One of the things we have in the Northeast is, if you leave a piece of land fallow for any period of time, it'll go to goldenrod and sassafras, and then it becomes trees.
Right.
It just on its own. But if you apply the cattle will graze back to the stone walls. They'll create that vista that we all love of open grassland. But it's not, a person with a piece of land can't really do that. But if you are able to get some cattle, either by hook or by crook, borrow them or, custom graze them for somebody else, and you can begin this process, and little by little, you can have a set of cattle. And if you pick the right kind of cattle, you can be very successful on grass. And at the end of the day, grass-fed beef is the low cost of production. For years, when I would be going into the markets in New York City trying to find out what product was in there, and there was always grass-fed lamb from New Zealand. And I'm like, how in the heck can grass-fed lamb fly from New Zealand to New York City? Well, it can, because it's the low cost of production. And we have the problem here. I have the problem many times when people say, well, I go to the grocery store and the grain-fed beef is cheaper than the grass-fed beef. And I said, yes, because of the government subsidy. The government pays money to the corn farmer, which they don't really want to do that, but they take the subsidy and they grow corn and soy, and then it goes to feed the cattle. And it becomes economically it's cheaper, but that's without measuring any of the, ecosystem impacts that are created by that whole system. But at the end of the day, feeding a ruminant grass is the low cost of production. And like I said, it's the cattle know how to do this. Many times it's fascinating to me. Like I would try to sell some meat to a co-op up in New Hampshire, and the administrators were interested, but the butchers were like, grass-fed beef. Rah, rah, rah. So I said, well, bring them down. Put them in a van, bring them down to the farm. So they came down, and it was like 6 or 8 of them, and they got out of the van. They were grumpy in spite of being on a day off, But by the end of the day, I couldn't get rid of them because they were like, oh my God, look at this. And I took them over to show them the cattle that were in a paddock, and I had an adjacent paddock ready for them to go into the graze. And as I opened the wire, the cattle started all getting up, and they're all like, what's going on? And I said, well, they know how to do this. They've done it every day for their lives. And they know that there's new food over there. So they're going to go in. But then as you stand back and watch, they go around the paddock and they harvest all of the tops of the plants first, and then they go and do the next. So the bovine has a long history of knowing how to do this. What messes it up is the human who says, now you got to stay there and eat until there's nothing left to eat, or
Right.
you're down to roots and dirt. But so the bovine knows how to do it. And if you're at all observant and interested, you could do it without a lot of resources. And that's the thing that's exciting for doing grass-fed beef. You really, you have to have a fence that keeps them off a road. But beyond that, a single electric wire is how we manage it. And people say, well, how do you keep them in just one single wire? I said, well, they're never hungry. There's no pressure on that wire. The wire only says eat here today, and tomorrow we'll let you eat here. But it's not like there's nothing to eat, and that the pressure on that fence is immense. You'll never hold them in if they have nothing to eat. And that's how a lot of grass-fed cattle are managed, actually. But it's very exciting possibility for people to jump in with not much for resources.
To add to that, another resource they don't need is a barn. They don't even need a tractor because the need for the tractor is pretty limited, and you can rent one or make an arrangement with your neighbor or whatever. So it's between the not needing a vast acreage or a barn and tractor, that kind of elaborate fencing and so forth. It's not much infrastructure, and what's exciting about that is that groups that haven't been able to participate in our food system as owners and operators, have an opportunity with grass-fed beef to get involved in something that's, that where they can make it economically, and it's also good work in the world to do, for the environment. And to just kind of segue into that the other thing that I'm excited about in terms of opportunities for people who haven't been involved in agriculture but would like to be, but have come up against obstacles, is that this grass-fed beef really opens up a new agrarian niche of finishing to skill. Right. And as Ridge was talking about, the cattle know how to eat, and of course that's what you're working with, their instinctive knowledge. But we don't want to imply that anybody can just turn cattle loose and they'll succeed, because it's you do have to know the basics of this rotation, because that's key to what makes it regenerative. Is that you do have to know, when to move the cattle, and especially for the finishing, that's where the real skill comes in. It's more demanding. The cattle need to be moved multiple times a day, whereas when you're raising the young stock, they might go a few days in the same piece. So that fits well with someone who has another job and is raising cattle as well, whereas the finishing is pretty much full-time job. And again, we want to stress there are resources out there. In our book, we mention Sarah Flack's book, The Art and Science of Grazing. So give a shout out to Sarah for doing that wonderful job. If people want to know, okay, how do I plan this? How do I go about it day to day? Well, that's a great resource for you. We have some of that information. We have the broad strokes in our book, but there's to get into more depth for people who are thinking, this is for me, maybe some grazing or, getting involved in that angle. There are resources out there to learn. There's a lot to be learned about how to do it. And it's just based on current science the soil science has advanced so much in the last, 20, 30 years. And so it's really ironic that we're still farmers, or most of them are still operating as though science hadn't learned anything since World War II. Whereas in fact, it's very exciting what science has learned. I always think of it starting, although this probably isn't true, but in the 1990s,
Mm-hmm.
Sarah Wright and Christine Nichols
Mm-hmm.
identified glomalin or glomalin, depending on how you want to say it, which is this key element in the soil that really is produced by the microbes, and that's what makes all these wonderful claims valid that we're making about combating climate change, storing carbon in the soil, and protecting against droughts and floods and all those things. It's really glomalin, and yet that was something like 1996, and here we are decades later, and the word isn't out that, hey, there's something we've discovered about how to grow food and how to protect the environment, that not nearly enough people are talking about. So we're so happy to have written this book and to have this opportunity today to talk about it.
Well, it's such an amazing resource. I learned so much. I've been reading on this topic for many years, but this book really is hitting all the angles and going in depth enough so that someone like me, who's read a bunch of books on this topic, really, I learned quite a bit.
Well, I just want to say, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's kind of on purpose, that we combined the big picture issues like, world hunger and social inequities and things like that with how to, because we felt that it wasn't just for farmers and ranchers. We feel that consumers and concerned consumers, enlightened consumers, people interested in the environment and worried about climate change, they need to know that this is not some fringe theory, that this is a science-based methodology. It's been proven, and I think by including some how-to tips, we're indicating to people like yourself who would be well informed and would need to know, okay, some people will say, okay, how? It's you say it combats climate change. How? So we have to offer enough scientific information and citations so that people realize, this is pretty thoroughly understood, and the bugs have been worked out. This is a shovel ready approach.
It totally is. Yeah. I just want to mention one thing I thought was really cool in the book. You talk about the different soil tests and nutrient density tests for your pasture that you can use. And it's very practical, because what the farmer is trying to figure out is how much production can this land support? How many cows can I put on this land? How much feed will I have? You want to talk a little bit about that? It's just one sort of practical, neat thing. You mentioned 3 different tests that you think, as a starter, that farmers can use to answer some of these questions when planning out their rotations and the amount of land and their stocking density.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the testing is the place to start, but the solution is always apply the cattle. I took over when I first leased the land trust. The farm had been just leased out to a local farmer for the last 30 years, and they planted corn every year, and they used the worst possible chemicals you could imagine. And so I went in and decided, well, I've got to plow it up and I got to plant something. So I did that. And it didn't grow very well in the areas you could see in the ends of the field where the spray rig had missed, that the plants would grow fairly well, but we grazed it. And it took a couple years, but what happened is that the plants began to create the penetration in the soil. We did a little field day where we took a penetrometer. That's a device you can just push into the ground and you can measure the kilograms of force it takes. And we were hitting this plow sole, this kind of seared area about 8 inches down all over the place. But then we went over near a chicory plant that we had planted, and you could push that directly into the ground 3 feet deep. So the chicory physically was breaking through that plow sole and making permeability to get the carbon down, to get the nutrients back up to the plants, and that whole kind of thing. So within 3 years, and I had grass that was 4 feet tall on that piece of land. And it dawned on me once when I was there taking a tour, and I looked across the fence at my neighbor's land. My neighbor's land, he'd been making hay for this whole time. He'd never, no cattle, he'd make hay. And he hadn't been able to mow the grass because it'd been wet. And we were managing for the bobolinks. So we wanted to let the bobolinks grow up and fledge before we mowed or grazed. And I realized my grass was 4 feet tall and his was 2 feet tall.
Huh.
And my grass was so dense. We have a tool called a grass stick where you stick it, you look at the height of the grass and then you slide it horizontally in the grass. The NRCS makes these, and it's got a little grid on it with little dots. So you look down on the stick and count the number of dots, and that tells you how much biomass per acre inch you have, depending on the type of grass it's growing. So it's not totally scientific, but it's pretty scientific. Well, when I slid the stick into my grass, I couldn't see the stick, let alone the dots. So I have grass that's 4 feet tall, so dense that I don't even get a reading on the density. So how much biomass per acre inch? It's just phenomenal. And the research, Richard Teague's the one we quote a lot, but he's the one that's done a lot of the research on this adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And I was talking to him once about a lot of his funding actually came from McDonald's. And I said, well, geez, you got to put me in touch with McDonald's. And he said, well, it's price. I said, well, I understand, Richard, but if I can have 3 times as much grass, then, there's the economics. And he said, you're wrong, Rich. And I said, what do you mean I'm wrong? He says, what we're finding is it's 5 to 6 times the biomass per acre. So it's just a stunning possibility to take a piece of land. Think of the piece of land, you're leasing it for whatever it is, $25 an acre. All of a sudden you have 3 to 6 times as much.
Well,
so now you're leasing it for $4 an acre. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
What you find is that, on the same piece of land, what Richard has told us is that, you'll see farms side by side, and the regeneratively grazed farms are much more grass, are much more productive, and yet they have many more animals because the fertility has been so attended to, not by add-ons, not by adding things on.
No inputs, just simply. And the thing is, I remember being interviewed by NPR when we had the bobolinks, and they were saying, well, don't you feel badly that you can't mow this hay? And I'm saying, actually, I don't, because my grass is 4 feet tall. Therefore, my roots are at least 4 feet deep. So I have a test that measures that, but the proxy of vibrant grasslands is indicative that you have you've taken care of all the flora and fauna under the soil, and you've got them rocking and rolling. You're not spraying any poisons. You're not poisoning them with any chemical fertilizers, and the evidence is that you've actually healed that land, and the net result is you can support more animals, and the economics, and on and on. And it happens so rapidly. This is the other thing that people say about building soil is going to take eons, and the reality is it happens very quickly.
Well, Richard says a year or two you'll see the response, but I want to make sure that we let people know what does create this fertility, because we've said we're not talking about add-ons. So what creates it? Is it the manure from the animals? A lot of people think that's true. Well, and of course it is to some extent. The manure is important, but the real story is probably the most important thing we can say today is that it's the microorganisms in the soil. And the whole point of this, of our practices of moving the cattle in a rotation that allows the land to regenerate that's already been grazed before it's regrazed. A lot of people call that rest. I don't like to call it rest because there's so much activity going on that you can't see. It's just under the ground. These the microbes and of course there's a lot of them involved. There's the whole food web involved, but really the stars, if you will, the leads are the mycorrhizal fungi and associated bacteria. And I think people will be interested to know about how this feedback works in a pasture early in the season, how the grazing is actually related to fertility. The picture the pasture, a cow taking a chomp of grass. When that happens, of course, the grass plant is partially defoliated. And so the plant sends a chemical signal down to the roots to release some of the carbon that's stored there, the carbohydrates. Everyone's familiar with photosynthesis from when we were school kids, right? We memorized that the carbon gets stored in the roots. Well, there it is. And so this is kind of a simplified version of what happens, but as I say, the plant knows it's defoliated. I'm defoliated. I've got to regrow. So it sends the chemical signal down to the roots to release some of those sugary carbohydrates down there into the soil. When that happens, that attracts microbes, and the microbes come, they feast on the exudates from the roots, they feast on each other. I mean, it's just this swirl of life and death of microbes. But what they set up, and like here again, here's where the mycorrhiza, the fungi, I'll call them the fungi for short, but the ones that live in, on, and around the roots are called mycorrhizal fungi, and they can create filaments, these long filaments that can, yards long, and they set up a two-way flow of nutrients and carbon. Basically, they're trading, this is of course an anthropomorphic term, trading the carbon that they are getting from the plant roots, excess carbon, for nutrients that the plant needs. And this is what scientist Christine Jones calls the bidirectional flow within these filaments. And these filaments can go far beyond the reach of the plant roots to get not just nitrogen and water and all kinds of elements that might be the plant might need a particular trace element. There's nowhere near its roots, but they can get it through this network of hyphae that come from the fungi. So this is the basis of nutrient cycling. So some of that carbon is eaten by the microbes, but a great deal of it is stored in the soil. And so the topsoil just increases, and the amount of carbon increases, and year by year. And Dr. Teague says that in one farm, for example, or ranch where he is working, they've been working for 15 years and measuring the carbon. And what he has found, that as long as animals are kept on the land, that the carbon continues to increase and accumulate. And so even for those who say, oh, the carbon won't last forever, it's not permanent. Well, it's continually being replenished. And even if it weren't even if it weren't replenished, wouldn't we all be pretty happy if we could know for the next 25, 50 years, carbon was going to be increased, drawn out of the atmosphere and stored in the soil? That would at least give us some time to figure out how we're going to reduce carbon emissions.
Yeah.
So we desperately need to start. Well, the plants are pulling it out of the air, but we need to foster the microbes that are going to store it in the soil. And that's what regenerative grazing is all about. I started all this talking about this feedback mechanism when the plant is defoliated by the chomping of the cow. And that starts the release of the exudates. And then that starts this very complicated microbial activity. And that's what we want to foster. And they're the ones that are creating the fertility.
Right.
It's the biology that creates the fertility, not going to the store and buying add-ons. You don't
Right.
eliminate all those the first year, but you'll maybe you cut your fertilizer use in a third the first year, and then a half, and then in a few years you've eliminated the purchased fertilizer, and you've gotten your biology working, and so you're all set. So your profitability is directly related to your soil health.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite case studies in your book is about a tobacco farm. It was like 100 acres of land that had been grown with tobacco and was really depleted. And the method of regenerative grazing there was to plant cover crops. Can you tell us about that system? Because it's a little different. If you've got grass, if you've got pasture, you can put cows on there. And apparently, like, there's a latent seed bed, and as you continue to graze there in that land will develop a more diverse grass buffet. But you can also plant cover crops, and that's a way to create, if you're taking something that was like corn and soy or tobacco and creating grazing land, that's another different way to jumpstart that. How does that process work? I thought that was a really cool case study.
That's the strategy, really, to go from some sort of cropland back to vibrant polyculture. And that was a farm I worked on as a consultant in North Carolina, and we were quite interested in all this grazing. And actually, one thing they had was a 2,000 acre cornfield that I was just, when I first saw it, I was just salivating. I'm like, give me that field, yeah.
That doesn't look like a nightmare to you? Because to me, I'm
No, I was so excited to say we could turn this into vibrant grassland.
Wow.
And he said that the owner said, well, you show me first. I said, okay. So we backed off onto one of the smaller farms where we had about 150 acres that had been in tobacco for years, like a lot of land that's so-called burned out, potato land in Maine, tobacco, and there's the cropping is just consistent year after year between the poisons and the glyphosate and everything. You've killed the biology. And so we ran into a couple of people, Gabe Brown and Ray Archuleta, and they said, plant a cover crop. So we did the soil test. We sent off a Haney soil test, and then that specified a 8 species cover crop. And this, what we're finding is it works best with a cocktail, with a mix. So we planted that cocktail cover crop on this essentially barren land, and it was remarkable. It grew, and we had about 100 head of cattle, and we fed them on this cover crop. We made little strips so that they could eat it, and then we gave them a new strip. And I actually, I have videos of it. The cover crop was over the cattle's head. And, they went into it, and you could hear them going, just chomping all this stuff. And the the results were stunning because the cattle gained weight. This is what's interesting on a cocktail cover crop. Grass-fed cattle can gain at a daily rate, equivalent to a feedlot. So one of the advantages of a feedlot, you put the cattle in here, you make them stand still, and you pour them energy in the corn and the soy. And with a cover crop, they can gain up over 3 pounds a day, which is just remarkable.
Wow.
Without any feedlot. But the results to the soil were stunning, because we just kind of shocked the microbial activity between the cattle, the activity of their feet, the nutrients, urine and manure, and trampling some of the organic matter from the leftover cover crop. It was just like it was so fast. It's just remarkable. It's an excellent strategy for taking a farm like a dairy farm that's been in corn for years and to shift it back to a perennial, polyculture. So it's a stunning, technique to start rather than just try and plant a perennial, and it's a much slower process. But the cover crop is very stimulating of that whole process. And yeah, it's very exciting. And back to what Lynn was saying about the soil micro the carbon and storing the carbon and all that, the real exciting part of that is the water cycle. So if you go actually on our website, there's a video, but there's a guy out west who cooked and did a perk test essentially on 3 adjacent fields.
Rich, I'm going to interrupt you because you mentioned a guy out in the Midwest. It's NRCS. It's the National
Bowls, yeah.
Conservation Service. So this is a government program and it's documented.
Right. But anyway, he basically just took a piece of irrigation pipe and poured a quart of water in and measured how long it takes to percolate. And so on the corn land that he tested was corn land that had been no-till seeded, the best modern practices for corn. And he poured the water in, and it took 30 minutes to percolate. So does anybody wonder why the Mississippi floods?
Yeah.
I mean, you have whole states of corn and soy in the Mississippi River watershed, and the water can't go in. It goes downhill. It's got to go somewhere. It goes. So then he moves over and he tests a scenario where it's extensively grazed the way it happens out west, where the cattle just put out all summer on, one piece of land. They're just turned out and they wander around. They eat whatever they want. So
they're not rotated, in other words.
Right. No, continuously grazed.
Yeah, the wrong way.
Right. So that was dramatically better than the corn scenario. That was about
better
and
than
Lynn will check me on the numbers, but that was 7 minutes. Okay. Then he moves over to the adaptive multi-paddock grazed, the way we do it. And the perk was 10 seconds. So the difference between 10 seconds and 30 minutes.
Wow.
It is a huge wow.
For the health of your soil, the structure is just and that's because you have well aggregated soil with all these little crumbs that have been formed again by the microbes, and they all have air spaces between them, and the water has a place to go and be retained, and then it can be utilized as needed in drought, because floods and droughts are just two sides of the same coin. It's a result of poorly structured or lack of structure in soil. So that's one of the things this addresses. So this is why I get so frustrated with people arguing about how much carbon is going to be stored, how long is it going to last. Well, the storage of carbon is perhaps the most urgently needed impact that we can have, benefit. Mm-hmm. But what about resilience in times of flood and drought? I mean, right. How important is that? And it's demonstrated. There's no question about it. Nobody argues about this. It's just a fact. This is what the regenerative grazing does. And again, what you're doing by the grazing, and grazing in this way of letting the paddock, you move the cattle when the grass is, when they've only eaten the tops, less than half. Then you move it and you let all this biology work in the soil, and you don't return cattle to that until it's fully regrown and you have the robust population of microbes, and then you can graze it again. And I mean, in this part of the country, in New England, you can you could go back a few times in the dry areas out west. You maybe once, you would need more land, and you could, that rotation would be maybe once a year. So what I'm indicating here is that you can do this anywhere. And we mentioned in the book, in the Chihuahuan Desert, there's now a green way of regenerative grazing in the Chihuahuan Desert, which with a lot of biological diversity and grassland birds, and it's not a miracle. It's people adapting the strategies that we outline in the book, of this utilizing flexing net fence to very easily move the cattle to a new bite of grass. And then people scoff at the idea that you can reverse desertification. And but it's really true, and it's not achieved by miracle. It's achieved by a very commonsensical way. You put the cattle in the most fertile areas that you've got, and you work gradually into the drier areas. And so you're just moving in, and you're making that you're working all around, and eventually you don't have any more desert.
Right. Yeah. And you can increase your stocking density. You start with low stocking density, and then you increase as you increase the amount of feed that's coming from the land. It's very cool. You've got so many cool case studies in the book. One thing we haven't talked about yet that you devote a lot of attention to in the book, and that's extremely important, is the processing of the beef. Because, raw milk, that's sort of cool. You don't require processing. A farmer can sell direct to consumers, but very few people can process their livestock on their farm. There are some people who have created models for this, but essentially, when we're thinking about a person who is going into farming now, looking for these low-cost ways to enter farming, producing nutrient-dense food, supporting their local economy, the big roadblock, I mean, you've described how the grazing system works perfectly. I mean, it requires some management, obviously, some planning, clearly, but it works pretty well. And I think the piece that isn't working very well for farmers is getting that livestock process. So take it from there, wherever you think the most important kernel of it, and then we'll go all the way to public policy.
The processing thing is a real conundrum.
Yeah.
And we have a big history in this. So basically, in our business, we have tried all different varieties. And as much as small is beautiful and everybody loves the small plant, there are some challenges with it, because disassembling an animal is a very skilled process. And it's hard to have enough people with the right skill level to do it efficiently in a small plant. And there's many, many inefficiencies in a small to medium-sized plant that are not, like one of them is we all would love to have the animal use nose to tail, all the parts. But when you get in a small plant, like a number of small plants we've worked with, they don't have a market for the oxtail and the liver and the heart, and they throw it in a dumpster, and they make me pay to throw it in a dumpster. I mean, it's outrageous. And you say, oh my God, how can this be? Well, when you think about it, if I'm harvesting 5 animals and I have 5 oxtails, how do I get that to market? How do I get those 5 oxtails to market with any value left by the time I pay transport and that kind of thing? So it's really a conundrum. And, I've come to the position that, I would like to piggyback on the larger producer because so many of the things they do are so much more efficient and the cost parameters are lower. And, there are some advantages to large. So there's no easy answer. There's lots of small plants that have been built attempting to solve all these problems, but many of them struggle, so.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to note, we've talked about the challenge with getting skilled people to work in the small plant in the sort of team approach to breaking a carcass that we touch on. But we don't want to leave you with thinking that you have where the skilled people are in the large plants. They're not at all.
Right.
It's an assembly line, and that's the amazing thing is you have people standing there all day and they're making the same cut, and none of them can do the whole job. They know how, they know how to do that. And so there's so much wrong with that picture that we can't do it all on this time period. But what we're thinking is that you said you wanted to move gradually toward the big picture, the public policy picture, and of course, that's that's been they've been batting that idea around for a long time of breaking up these giant corporations. There's basically four multinational companies that they're operating all over the world and killing their plants are killing thousands of animals a day, and they're controlling 85% of the meat, and so that's that makes for a lot of problems, and we witnessed that with the pandemic. And the name of our book is Grass-Fed Beef for a Post-Pandemic World. That's one of the things we've learned, that right now that was a shock to our system, the pandemic, but look at all the shocks that we have to account: pandemics, extreme weather events, terrorism, war, ransomware attacks. So it just there's so many reasons why it does not make sense to have these gigantic processing facilities that are owned and operated by these, by just a handful of corporations. And so, I think one thing that this is going to have to be a multi-pronged effort. And there's the public policy issue. There's whatever you can do on the, the government side to make, to break up some of these big, monopolies. But also people raising more people all over the country doing this regenerative grazing, growing grass-fed beef. It's just a lot lot easier to absorb shocks. If you're depending on your beef coming up from a couple thousand miles away or even from overseas, you're really in a vulnerable position. But if the cattle were raised a couple hours from where you live and is processed in the same region where you live, you've got and all this is happening all over the country. Then you have a lot of farmers and ranchers who need the processing service, who want to be rewarded for producing a quality product. They don't get paid for pounds. They would like to get a recognition for the fact that they've raised animals in a way that's benefiting the environment, benefiting health, and so forth. And they need processing. So there's the hope that I think referred to it in the book as the perfect storm. Perhaps the perfect storm of conditions will arise where we have the people recognizing the need to get away from the fossil fuels and the climate emissions associated with conventional beef production, and the people want to get away from the need for imported fertilizer and so forth. And as people realize, gee, regenerative grazing has a lot of these answers, more people will be doing it under different climatic conditions, geographic conditions, and more smaller processors will be able to, establish customer bases where they didn't have them before. But it's a complex picture.
Yeah, one of the conundrums with the whole processing animals is what we refer to as balancing the carcass.
Right.
So most small to medium-sized producers go and have the animals custom killed, and then they get all the boxes of the pieces. And most small companies struggle with the fact that they don't have a home for all the pieces. They get a lot of it sold, but there's still a bunch of this or a bunch of that or a bunch of this. What's that?
I was just saying mostly burger. Most of the carcasses.
Right. And what you typically do is say, okay, I can't sell it right today, so I'll put it in the freezer. And then what happens is it loses value. And I mean, believe me, I have experience. And what's hard is that the big companies, what they do is the packer balances the carcass. So in other words, they make all the pieces go away, and they have such a volume. They have the advantage. I mean, they'll sell the pancreas gland, they'll sell all the oxtail, they'll sell the liver, the heart, the bones, all the pieces get sold. And it's very hard to do that on a small scale. So there's no straight line, easy answers, I guess is the answer. But what is interesting to me is that the marketplace has embraced this product. And if you read in the book, pre-COVID, we had this agreement with Performance Food Group agreement. We'd spent quite a bit of time pitching their salespeople, and we had all these customers drop in. Gillette
Stadium,
right. Brown University, Harvard, Dartmouth. All these people, Cornell, they all wanted this product. And we were like stunned, and we were like, how are we going to produce all this product?
But we liked that problem. And then we were
right.
COVID.
And then COVID hit, and boom, it stopped. It didn't slow down. It just stopped. And we are still working with that company, and they're very actively want to try and get us going again. And in the interim, all those universities are still buying product of the grass-fed, but it's like coming from New Zealand or Uruguay or Australia.
But we have to remember that prior to COVID, from 2012, the grass-fed beef market was constantly growing, and it's people are still buying grass-fed, but they're buying imported. And what they don't understand is that for the most part, that imported grass-fed beef is not raised regeneratively. So they're not getting the environmental. They think, oh, I'm doing the right thing. I'm buying grass-fed beef. It's not just good for my health; it's good for the environment because of the way it's raised. Well, it's true that it's not grain, but it's not raised. It's not raised, rotationally or regeneratively. So you don't get the carbon storage, you don't get all these benefits, and that's what people don't know because it's
right. That's takes
USA, but that just means it's minimally processed, packaged in the USA. It's not raised in the USA. So that's another message that needs to get out there.
Yeah, that's the policy. I've gone into grocery stores when I'm selling, and I can take a picture of the whole meat case with 6 or 7 choices of grass-fed beef, all these different companies, and all of it is from elsewhere. And it all says Product USA on it, because the law is that if you bring a container load of beef into the Port of Boston bring it to a processing plant in mass, and you grind it up, completely legal to write on it, product of USA. I mean, it's just outrageous. And the consumer has no clue. I mean, the consumer is trying to do the right thing. Oh, grass fed. Oh, great. We got some choices here. But in reality, none of it's from the USA. And none of it is necessarily regeneratively grazed. So
Right.
it's
Yeah, we're saying that none of it, the meat that's labeled product of the USA almost certainly is not, because the domestic producers are not putting product of the USA. So you have to know, where the company or brand, transparency is really the answer at the moment.
Yeah, I've noticed in some places, like I was in Florida, and I noticed that there was grass-fed beef marketed as from Florida. So that's helpful, but yeah, it is a big problem. I am curious. I read the book, but I read it quickly, so I may have missed it. I don't know if you mentioned anything about Organic Prairie. Because I feel like, so Organic Prairie is the meat section of Organic Valley Co-op. Are they supporting a lot of grass-fed producers in the United States right now, or has that not come up to scale yet?
not that I know of. There's a couple of big companies that have embraced grass-fed, Panorama and a couple others. Well, now a lot of companies have embraced. Nyman Ranch just announced last week they're going to have a grass-fed program. So it's a sexy thing once again, but it's really a question. And a lot of the big companies, what their inclination is to take grass-fed cattle and put them on a feedlot and feed them forage. So in other words, the system that's worked for them in the past by doing the finish, creating the fat by putting the animals together, and then bringing the feed to them. A lot of companies are doing that with grass-fed beef, so that the animal is essentially, parked in a feedlot, and they're fed just grass, but they're
So people are trying to game the system. Grass-fed isn't even 100% grass-fed isn't the best name for this product, because, but pasture raised isn't either, because some companies have tried feeding them even grain in the pasture, and they're still calling it pasture raised.
No, that's a big one. That's a big one in the Northeast here. That Whole Foods is the big one behind that. So it's pasture raised, but we feed them the grain in the pasture.
Oh, that is.
You're kidding me. It's like.
So that's what we mean when we say the transparency is really important.
Well, the smoke and mirrors are extreme, because the consumer has enough of an inkling to know that they want this.
Right.
And so there's all these corporations. Well, how can we do it without spending any money? And they just, can we cut this corner? Can we cut that corner? And there is no regulation, so they can cut lots of corners and get away with it.
Yeah. We encourage folks to look for American Grass-Fed certified. Are there other certifiers that are consumer facing?
Yeah, they're American Welfare Approved as a grass-fed category. PCO, the Pennsylvania Certified Organic, has a grass-fed standard. They're the ones that certify maple, whatever it is.
Maple Creamery?
Maple Creamery, yeah. Maple Hill Creamery. So there are good standards out there, but
it's a pretty hard situation. And look at what organic is going through and has gone through with the so organic is finally, people understand that it's important, and they want their food to be organically raised. So now there you've got these ridiculous situations where you've got these gigantic farms where animals are not even on pasture, and technically they're organic, but the hydroponic is another issue in terms of the plants, in terms of the vegetables. But so I bring that up just to point out that at this point, it's a jungle out there, and uh, it's really hard for people to know, what they're buying, and so it's never been more important to be educated. And but things change. We all know rapidly, and what's happening with climate change, as I indicated. That we're only beginning to see the problem. It's not just from flooding, where of course you have human populations on the move and you have fields flooded, but it's not just that. It's plants that were grown in um, for decades or for centuries in Italy, say. So you think, well, so maybe they'll be grown in Germany. Well, not necessarily. There's a lot of factors involved, and you're not necessarily going to think, well, just move everything, you know, um, away from the equator. But it doesn't work that way. There's gonna be a lot of hunger,
Mhm.
and so and this, diminishing this use of fossil fuels needs to be. We need to do that and be concerned about climate emissions. So all these things are are getting to the point where we just can't deny them anymore. People can't deny them, and so I think that that works well for regenerative grazing because it addresses these needs, and it can feed it can use ruminant animals to um, process plants to provide healthy protein for populations, many of whom will be displaced by climate change. So all I'm saying is that there are events totally out of our control that are coming to the forefront rapidly that are going to have an impact, and I think they can't help but y- y- you know be important for people learning the potential of progressive beef and regenerative grazing to address these global as well as local issues.
Definitely. Yeah. Ultimately, we do a lot of consumer education about how to read labels, but ultimately you need a relationship with local farmers. And then you'll learn all of these things in terms of your local economy and your local climate and the struggles that the farmers around you are going through. And that's the way to really get involved. Do you all have any closing thoughts on?
Well, one quick thing I wanted to mention, just because it's a platform and it's in the book, is one of the things we hear all the time when we say grass-fed beef. They say, "Well, what about the methane?"
Oh, yeah, good point. Yeah,
And
thanks
the
for.
methane is just a non-issue if you put the cattle on grass. If you put the cow in a concrete in a university and you put a plastic bag around them, yeah, they're going to generate methane.
Right.
But when you put them in a field where you have methanogenic bacteria and the
Yep.
cow's nose is right down there, it becomes it's not the issue that's been built up to be, and it's a big one because people are trying to do the right thing, and
I
but
think it is important for people to understand in a pasture there's two oxidation zones where the methane is neutralized. One is at the soil line by the methanotrophic bacteria that Rich mentioned, and there's another oxidation zone that happens where the water is transpired from the plant, and so and see that's an example of what climate activists do need to understand these issues. And I guess that's the thing that I want to leave with. The people that should be most excited about this and promoting it are the environmentalists and particularly the climate activists. But they have learned well the the um, the problems with conventional beef production, and they do not understand yet, most of them don't, that these things do not apply to regeneratively grazed ruminants. In fact, regenerative grazing addresses these problems, but it's hard to get people to listen. They're so used to, they're so used to thinking, beef is bad and particularly bad for the environment, and it's a tough it's clearly it's not a soundbite. It's taken us almost an hour and a half to say all this, and people don't have the message, but the climate activists need to take the time to understand this. And this is why we put, as much science as we did in the book, so that people and the references, people understand this is peer-reviewed science. So once the environmentalists realize that that this is a solution, this is a critically not the only solution, but it's an important climate strategy, then we'll have that whole cohort of people who understand it and who can make things happen in terms of public policy and in terms of land use planning and so forth and so on.
Definitely. Well, I encourage everyone to reach out to their local farmers and buy direct, and use the regenerative farm map at regenerationinternational.org to connect with local farmers. And so I've been talking with Lynne Pledger and Ridge Shinn. They're the authors of the book Grass-Fed Beef for a Post-Pandemic World. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. I encourage everyone to read this book. It's the latest book, but it's also, I think, a synthesis of a lot of the information that has come before it. It's very timely, really well researched, and covers all the ground that we've talked about, but lots and lots of resources in there. It's a great entry point, I think, for both consumers and for people who are thinking about getting into the business. So thank you so much for this excellent book.
Thank you.
Thank you.